Hi there. Over the past few weeks, I've been looking at the myth that it is not really possible for an adult to reach native-like levels in a new language. I've put forward the idea that there are 4 pillars that hold up this myth, and my intention over the past few weeks has been to destroy each one of these myths one by one. So the first week I looked at translation and why excessive use of it will positively undermine your efforts to learn the language to the highest of levels. In the second week, I looked at passion and why it is critically important that a learner gets really engaged, passionate, involved in actual learning. In the third week, last week in fact, I looked at that if you're going about learning language in ways that reflect that it is knowledge as opposed to skills, you're going to really undermine your efforts to learn the language. It doesn't matter whether at the lowest levels or the highest levels, but in fact at the highest levels, it's impossible to do that. So this week I'm going to look at the fourth pillar, and that is the issue that if you discount all the practices I've referred to over the past few weeks, how in fact do you go about learning a language? Well, it's not really much out there. So most people, when they get sort of pushed between a rock and a hard place, they'll resort to translation, or they'll resort to going to a dictionary, or they'll resort to doing some study or something like that, and they don't quite know what else they can do. So that's the issue that I think, especially at the highest levels, because at the highest levels, those methods I refer to really don't work at all and will never work. At the lower levels, somehow you can think they're working and they do something, but high levels is just obviously inappropriate. So what in fact does a person do to learn a language? Well, as I explained last week, language is a skill, and we sort of know what's involved in learning a skill. You've got to actually notice what's going on, and then you've got to do something about it and start to do the thing that will sort of approximate to the skill that you can see. And you start at the lowest levels and you build yourself up layer by layer, as it were. And as you do the things, you notice that things aren't going the way you want, so you adjust it a bit more, and then you do a bit more, and somehow by adjusting, by looking, by trying, somehow we learn the skill. Now, in a skill like basketball, for example, and as I said before, the principles are identical. You can actually see how the game's played, you can try for yourself, and you can see exactly what's going on. It's a visual thing. So whether you can bounce the ball or whether you can shoot the ball in the basket, it's easy to see. Now, in learning a language, it's interesting because, you have to use your eyes, but the eyes are not critically important. What's critically important is your listening. And listening is a much more sort of elusive kind of skill, you could say. So it's really up to us to either whether we hear it or we don't hear it. And it's the same in basketball, whether you see it or you don't see it. In language, it's whether you hear it or you don't hear it. And that's the fundamental fact, basically underlies all language learning in terms of the speaking of the language I'm talking about now, of course. And in language, there are different elements to listen to. So there's the individual sounds, for example, the phonemes, as we call them. In English we've got something like 44 sounds. And then there's the actual stress of, in a word, like when you say about, the second syllable is stressed, not the first. So you've got to learn to listen to where the stress is. Then you've got to learn to listen how the words get combined. Then you've got to listen to the intonation, the tones going up and down, and then the rhythm of the sentence. So each of these is an element to listen to and to master. And on top of all that, that's only the sound we're talking about, right? Then of course there's also the meaning. And with meaning, there's all different levels of meaning. So there's a lot to listen to, and it's easy to get bamboozled, easy to get confused, easy to get distracted, easy to get stuck on one aspect of the listening and not focus on other elements of the listening. So of course we all did it in our first language, and there are many people, of course, who master the second language to the highest native-like levels. So it's well within our capacity, but the issues that are there, you can see there are more sort of subtle issues involved because you can't really see what you're doing. You have to hear it. And it's a little bit more complicated because, as I mentioned before, there are all these different elements to listen to. I want us to learn to focus on. And if you don't focus on these elements one at a time, and you don't work at developing the skills in one area at a time, it's going to be difficult to put it all together. And on top of all that, you've got all the other distractions that we've talked about, is that people saying you should be learning, you should be trying to memorize this. And then there's also the issues that relate to our own personal character, that we start to get worried about things sometimes when things don't go the way we want it to go, or we get worried about making mistakes and looking foolish. So there are lots of elements that can get in the way of this listening that we have to do, and we can get distracted from it. So to learn the language to highest levels, it's necessary to focus all our attentions on our listening and our perception and our understanding, and learning to control the elements we can control one at a time. So if you haven't been doing this in a conscious way, and it just sort of happens in a sense unconsciously because it's just something you do without really knowing what's going on, then it's much harder to start to get it under control. Now, of course you can, there's no issue with that, but it takes a bit of self-training or training to learn to sort of, in a more methodical way, to focus on the elements that aren't working for you. I'll talk about one example of a way of using our noticing and our listening and our natural, sort of, you could say, natural learning skills. So when we have something that we don't understand or we don't sort of follow, our brain tries to make sense of it. And one of the ways that the brain tries to make sense of it is to see patterns or to hear patterns. And it's one of the elements that, unfortunately, in formal language learning, there's virtually nothing that's around. I mean, at times people do it, but in any systematic way, very few teachers or very few methodologies actually deal with this. And that is the skill of looking for and listening for patterns, recognizing patterns in language. Now, you may be starting thinking of rules, the rules in the grammar books, or rules that you may have studied. Well, rules are an abstraction of the pattern. So somebody has sat down, observed the patterns, and written up the rules. And so that's what people do, study the rules. But what the step they've missed out, and it actually throws you off, that's what happens, is that the rules, as I mentioned before, the grammar rules, whatever you do, it's an intellectual abstraction, and it doesn't really relate to our perception, and necessarily to our sort of abilities. Patterns, however, are intimately related to our awareness, to our listening, to our capacities. And that's what I suggest, that if you want to start to improve how you're going about learning, start looking for patterns. So patterns are evident in all aspects of language, whether it's numbers, and in numbers there are very, very strong patterns that you can start noticing in terms of how we put the numbers together. So for example, we have 13, then we've got 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and so forth. And so these are patterns that are established long ago, obviously, when the language was put together. And then you can see the patterns in the way we write. So there are patterns there. There are patterns in the way we express some things, and the patterns are a sort of efficient way of making sense of the things we're trying to say, or things how we see reality. So these patterns are something that you start looking for patterns and start understanding there are patterns everywhere. It'll start to heighten your awareness, to heighten your sense of noticing, heighten the sense of activity and engagement. And that's what learning is all about, is to become more perceptive, listen better, to see more, to hear more. And by looking for patterns, you're exercising these skills. And that's why looking for patterns are a great way to help you actually push your language up, and push in so many different ways. There's a lot more that can be said about this particular issue, but for now I hope you have a sense that by changing the way you're learning language, it'll actually change the results you get. So I hope that this kind of expose I've conducted about this myth has tickled some nerves, tickled some thoughts in your mind, and you're now going to approach it with a whole new attitude and a whole new approach, and start to get really excited about the fact that yes, you can approach, and yes, you can achieve native-like levels in English or in any other language you're learning. So that's it for me now. So thank you very much for listening. It's been Andrew Weiler here.